Ethan Collins had always felt a magnetic pull toward his village, though he hadn't visited in years. The city's unrelenting hum, the traffic, the noise, the constant rush, had drained him, leaving him longing for the quiet, sun-soaked fields of his childhood. As he drove along the winding country roads, memories of dusty paths and wooden fences returned like an old, comforting song. He had always been fond of horses, not just for their strength and beauty but for the silent companionship they offered. There was an honesty to them, a way of communicating without words, that humans rarely matched. The village looked almost frozen in time. Narrow lanes curved past stone cottages with blooming gardens, and smoke lazily spiraled from chimneys. Ethan's heart quickened as he approached his cousin Daniel's estate, a modest but proud property at the edge of the village. Daniel had stayed here, tending to horses and maintaining the family tradition, while Ethan had chased careers and city lights. Pulling up near the stable, Ethan's breath caught. There, standing like a silent sentinel in the morning light, was a horse unlike any he had ever seen. Towering, chestnut brown with a sheen that reflected the sun, the animal exuded a quiet majesty that made Ethan pause. He had seen horses before, plenty of them, yet none seemed to embody such raw presence. Daniel appeared at the stable door, wiping his hands on a rag. He was older than Ethan remembered, his face lined from years of work and worry, but his smile remained familiar. Ethan. Back from the city, I see, Daniel said, voice warm but cautious, as though unsure what to expect. Yeah, Ethan replied, stepping out of the car. It feels like a lifetime since I last saw this place. Daniel gestured toward the horse. You remember Titan? Ethan blinked, taken aback. Titan, he echoed, approaching the massive creature. The horse's dark eyes followed him calmly, and Ethan felt an unexpected connection, a magnetic pull that stirred something he couldn't yet name. He reached out tentatively, letting his fingers brush the sleek mane. The horse lowered its head, nudging his hand gently, and Ethan laughed softly. You've grown since I last saw you, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. As Ethan ran his hand along Titan's broad shoulder, the sound of footsteps made him turn. Lucas Harper was standing at the edge of the yard, leaning casually against a fence post. Ethan's chest tightened, a memory he hadn't anticipated resurfacing so quickly. Lucas had been his childhood friend, mischievous and magnetic, with a knack for appearing exactly when he was least expected. His hazel eyes held the same mischievous glint, but there was a subtle edge now, something more grown up, more calculated. Ethan Collins, Lucas said with mock surprise. Still chasing horses instead of city dreams? Ethan smiled, though his mind felt suddenly alert, tense. Some things don't change. Horses, for instance. Lucas's smile deepened, almost unreadable. Or maybe you just never outgrow certain passions. His words lingered, ambiguous, as though meant to test Ethan. Daniel stepped between them, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Don't start any trouble. Lucas just got back in town. Thought you two might catch up. Ethan nodded, forcing calm, but he felt a flutter of curiosity and unease. Lucas had returned without warning, and there was something in the way he observed Ethan, a quiet intensity that suggested secrets or intentions hidden behind that familiar grin. Later, they found themselves walking along the edge of the fields, Titan following lazily behind. Ethan couldn't help but compare Lucas to the horse, in a way, both commanding attention without demanding it, both capable of sudden energy and sudden stillness. As they walked, Lucas spoke of trivial matters at first, childhood memories, village gossip, even Daniel's stubborn habits. Yet beneath the conversation, Ethan felt currents of something unsaid, a tension that made him both wary and strangely drawn in. You've changed, Ethan, Lucas said finally, halting and turning to look at him. Not just grown up, changed. Different. There's something in you now I didn't expect. Ethan swallowed, unsure how to answer. There was truth in Lucas's observation. Years in the city had shaped him, exposed him to experiences he rarely shared with anyone. Yet this statement stirred an unexpected awareness of himself, an awareness of feelings he had not fully acknowledged. They arrived at the stable as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the yard. Titan shifted his massive body, snorting softly, sensing the subtle tension between the two men. Ethan ran his hand along the horse again, grounding himself. "Care to ride?" Lucas asked suddenly, gesturing toward one of the smaller horses tethered nearby. The question seemed innocent enough, but Ethan felt the weight behind it, the unspoken challenge, the invitation to step closer into Lucas's orbit. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Sure. Why not?" As they mounted and guided the horses into the open fields, the air carried the scent of earth, hay, and freedom. The rhythm of the horses' hooves against the dirt, the wind brushing past, created a strange intimacy. Words were unnecessary, yet the silence between them was heavy with unspoken recognition, memories, and the subtle stirrings of desire Ethan could not yet name. By the time they returned to the stable, dusk had settled, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Ethan dismounted, heart pounding in a way that had little to do with riding. Lucas lingered nearby, hands resting lightly on the fence, eyes watching him with an unreadable expression. "Same time tomorrow?" Lucas asked, casual, but Ethan sensed a challenge in his tone, a silent pull that promised complication, intrigue, and perhaps, danger. Ethan forced a smile, brushing dirt from his jeans. "We'll see." As he walked toward the house, the last rays of sunlight catching Titan's glistening coat, Ethan felt a mixture of anticipation and unease. Something had shifted today, though he could not yet place what. The village, the horse, Lucas's unexpected presence, it was as if a door had been unlocked, revealing corridors he had long avoided exploring. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that returning to this place would change everything. Ethan awoke the next morning with a lingering heaviness in his chest, a dull ache that was not entirely physical. The apartment was quiet, as if it, too, were holding its breath, waiting for him to move again. The sensation of paralysis had passed, but it had left an imprint far deeper than he anticipated. Even simple tasks, pouring coffee, opening the blinds, walking across the room, felt like a delicate negotiation with his own body. Every step was a reminder of fragility, every shadow a subtle echo of the fear he had endured. That he tried to occupy his mind, retreating into work, sketching patterns that twisted and curved across digital canvases. Yet his thoughts returned relentlessly to Julian. Ethan could not shake the memory of that night, the closeness, the tension, the way Julian had entered the room as if it were his own. He told himself it was over, that nothing had happened, yet the unease lingered like a persistent shadow. Julian's presence in the apartment felt heavier now, more deliberate, as if he were aware of the subtle fracture in Ethan's composure and intended to observe it. It was during one of these quiet mornings, while Ethan sat sketching in the corner of his living room, that Leo Matthews appeared. Leo, a colleague from Ethan's design class, had asked to drop by to discuss a collaborative project. He was energetic, confident in a soft way, and his presence carried warmth that Ethan hadn't realized he was craving. There was an ease to Leo that contrasted sharply with the weight of Julian's attention, a lightness that almost made Ethan feel safe. They spoke over coffee and laptops, their conversation meandering from work to personal stories. Ethan found himself laughing quietly, the sound foreign but welcome. He realized that in Leo's company, the tight knot in his chest loosened just slightly. It was a small, fragile relief, yet enough to make him aware of how much he had been carrying alone. Faceless visuals emphasized this contrast, hands typing on a laptop, shadows crossing the room, the curl of steam rising from coffee cups. Even as he felt comfort in Leo's presence, Ethan was painfully aware that Julian was watching in the periphery. He noticed small behaviors, subtle but unmistakable, Julian's arrival in the kitchen at odd moments, the way his gaze lingered just beyond sight, the carefully timed interruptions that seemed designed to unsettle him. Ethan felt himself tightening again, anxiety coiling in his chest. The balance he had just begun to reclaim was delicate, a fragile bridge between fear and curiosity, between vulnerability and the tentative stirrings of desire. Days passed with this precarious rhythm. Ethan grew closer to Leo, confiding small truths about his life, sketching together late into the evenings, and sharing laughter that felt illicit against the backdrop of tension at home. Julian, meanwhile, maintained a constant, almost imperceptible pressure, inserting himself into conversations, offering help that Ethan didn't need, appearing at doorways with a casual familiarity that felt invasive. Every interaction forced Ethan to navigate a labyrinth of emotions, weighing fear, attraction, confusion, and the desperate need for normalcy. The conflict reached a subtle peak one afternoon when Julian appeared unexpectedly while Ethan and Leo were reviewing a design. Julian leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, observing with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ethan felt the knot tighten, the room suddenly smaller, charged with the unspoken tension that neither addressed. Leo noticed Ethan's discomfort and offered a gentle, questioning glance, one that made Ethan both grateful and guilty. He wanted to explain, to confess the chaos in his heart, but the words stuck somewhere between fear and shame. As Julian finally left, the room seemed to exhale in relief. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he closed the laptop. He realized he was walking a fine line between independence and submission, between reclaiming agency and surrendering to the subtle manipulations of someone he was meant to trust. His mind spun with scenarios he had never considered: confrontation, exposure, flight. And yet, he was also drawn inexplicably to the magnetic pull Julian seemed to exert, a force that Ethan neither fully understood nor wanted to. That night, alone in his bedroom, Ethan reflected on the differences between Julian and Leo. Leo offered kindness, respect, and the gentle warmth of someone who truly saw him. Julian offered intensity, control, and an unsettling sense of dominance that Ethan could not ignore. His journal, a faceless confidant, became a place to untangle these threads: sketches of shadows, notes of feelings he could not voice, reflections on fear, desire, and boundaries. Writing allowed him to feel some control over the narrative of his own life. Even as reality seemed increasingly unpredictable, the complexity of his emotions became clearer when Julian left a note on his desk the next morning, innocuous in wording but heavy in implication. It read simply, "I hope you're taking care of yourself. Let me know if you need anything." The words seemed harmless, yet Ethan's heart raced. The sentence hung in the air, and he could not dismiss the undercurrent of possession, the subtle reminder of that night. He understood, with a growing clarity, that Julian's attention was not casual. It was calculated, and it forced Ethan to confront feelings he had not yet named. Ethan's thoughts returned repeatedly to Leo, to the warmth and comfort he provided. In Leo's presence, Ethan felt recognized and safe; in Julian's, he felt scrutinized, measured, and constrained. The tension between these two poles, friendship and forbidden fascination, safety and danger, defined his days. He realized that he needed to make choices, to assert boundaries, to protect his emotional and physical autonomy, and to acknowledge desires that had been buried in fear. As the section drew to a close, Ethan stood by the window of his apartment, gazing at the city sprawled beneath him. The skyline, bathed in the orange hue of dusk, seemed both distant and unreachable. He understood that the days ahead would demand courage, careful navigation, and clarity of heart. Julian's presence would not simply vanish, and neither would the emotions he stirred. Yet, Ethan felt a flicker of resolve. He was not powerless. He could reclaim space, both literal and emotional, and begin to define the boundaries that would protect him. And in the quiet between the hum of the city and the shadows of his apartment, a sense of anticipation lingered. Choices awaited, confrontations loomed, and the delicate threads of trust, attraction, and self-discovery were poised to unravel, or strengthen, depending on the path Ethan would take next. Ethan awoke to the soft light of morning filtering through the blinds, a fragile calm settling over him. The city beyond his window moved with indifferent rhythm, indifferent to the turmoil inside his apartment. The events of the past days lingered like shadows, heavy and persistent. Julian had been careful lately, polite, almost distant, but Ethan could feel the undercurrent of control, subtle and constant, threading through every interaction. The tension was no longer a sudden shock but a low, constant hum, reminding him that boundaries were fragile and trust must be earned, not assumed. That he moved cautiously through the apartment, checking the small routines he had established: brewing coffee, opening windows, straightening the stack of sketchbooks on his desk. The act of reclaiming ordinary life felt revolutionary. Even the smallest decisions, how far to walk in a hallway, whether to answer a text, had become exercises in autonomy. Julian appeared in the doorway, casual and disarming as ever. "Good morning, Ethan," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Ethan nodded, resisting the urge to shrink or avert his gaze too quickly. The battle for personal space and emotional control had begun to feel like its own form of strength. The days that followed tested him further. Julian's attention fluctuated unpredictably, sometimes distant, sometimes intrusive, always just enough to remind Ethan of the unspoken tension. At the same time, Leo's presence became a steady source of reassurance. They spent hours together sketching, planning projects, and sharing stories, each conversation deepening a bond Ethan had not allowed himself before. There was no need for words about what had happened with Julian. The comfort in Leo's company spoke for itself. Faceless visuals highlighted their connection through shared hands over sketches, leaning shadows, and lingering glances at computer screens. Despite the comfort of Leo's presence, Ethan knew that confrontation was inevitable. He could not continue to navigate this liminal space, caught between fear, attraction, and curiosity, without asserting his boundaries. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the apartment, Ethan resolved to speak openly with Julian. He rehearsed words in his mind, carefully balancing honesty, caution, and strength. The decision was not made lightly. Julian's presence had an undeniable gravity that made every interaction feel precarious. When Julian appeared in the living room later, Ethan's heart raced. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "We need to talk," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Julian tilted his head, an inscrutable expression on his face. "About what?" he asked, voice smooth, controlled. Ethan felt the tension coil tighter in his chest but pressed forward. "About boundaries. About respect. I need to feel safe in my own space." Julian's expression did not change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a momentary crack that spoke more than words could. He leaned against the doorway, silent for several moments. The stillness was almost unbearable. Then, finally, he spoke. "I understand," he said, carefully neutral. "If that's what you need, I'll respect it." Ethan did not fully trust the words, but the acknowledgement itself was a small victory. The air in the apartment felt lighter, though still tinged with the weight of unspoken history. Over the next few days, Ethan began reclaiming his routines more fully. He walked through the apartment with confidence rather than hesitation, engaged in projects with renewed focus, and allowed himself moments of joy without the constant undercurrent of fear. Leo's presence remained a stabilizing force, a reminder that connection could be gentle, consensual, and affirming. Ethan realized that trust was not simply given, it was negotiated, tested, and protected. And for the first time in weeks, he felt a fragile sense of agency in a space that had once felt oppressive. Yet even as he rebuilt his autonomy, Julian's influence lingered, subtle but unmistakable. A note left on the kitchen counter, neatly folded, carried words that seemed innocuous: "Hope your day goes well. Remember, I'm here if you need anything." Ethan's heart raced briefly before he set it aside. He recognized the undercurrent of control in the phrasing and acknowledged it without allowing it to dominate his response. The choice was his: to react, to ignore, or to engage on his own terms. And this recognition, this ability to define the narrative of his own life, was the most important step of all. One evening, as Ethan sat by the window sketching the city skyline, he received a message from Leo. It was brief but warm: "Want to grab a coffee tomorrow? There's a new place I think you'll like." Ethan smiled faintly, the gesture private but real. The simple act of choosing connection, of stepping toward trust and safety, felt revolutionary after weeks of uncertainty. The contrast between Leo's openness and Julian's subtle manipulation had never been clearer. Ethan was learning to navigate both with discernment, understanding that emotional clarity required boundaries as much as affection. The story did not end neatly. Julian's presence remained a part of the apartment, an ambiguous force, a shadow on the edges of Ethan's life. But Ethan's response to that presence had changed fundamentally. He walked with intention, spoke with honesty, and allowed himself to experience connection without surrendering control. In the quiet of the apartment, he recognized that fear and attraction were not incompatible with strength, they were elements that could be acknowledged, examined, and guided by choice. As the night deepened, Ethan closed his sketchbook and looked toward the dimly lit hallway, imagining the path ahead. The tension, though not fully resolved, had shifted. It was no longer a cage but a challenge to navigate with care. He understood that some questions would linger, some boundaries would need constant reinforcement, and some emotions would remain complicated. Yet the ability to confront, to assert, and to connect had transformed his sense of self. Ethan felt the first stirrings of freedom, not freedom from Julian entirely, nor freedom from fear, but freedom to act with clarity and self-respect. He could choose his relationships, safeguard his autonomy, and explore his identity on his own terms. The future was uncertain, but uncertainty no longer paralyzed him. It was a canvas, wide and open, waiting for choices, courage, and growth, and as he turned toward the window once more, the city lights reflected faintly in his eyes, mirroring the quiet determination that had begun to take root. Some shadows lingered, some questions remained unanswered, but Ethan Collins had reclaimed his footing. And in that reclamation, he discovered something stronger than fear, more compelling than curiosity, the quiet power of agency and the promise of his own resilience.